Today I'm going to teach you 10 Indonesian words and phrases that you have to know before you travel to Indonesia. I've been to Indonesia 7 times and I've spent about 2.5 years there. But these are the phrases that I think will be the most helpful for somebody who only has a few days or a week to learn before visiting. If you want something more advanced or you still want more after this video, I've made 2 other videos as well if you want to go check them out. So now let's get into it. First up, we have titles and honorifics. These are things like Mr., Miss, Mrs., Doctor, and they work very similar in Indonesian except that you use them all the time, even for people that you know pretty well. And you also use them with the person's first name, because Indonesians don't really have last names like most other cultures. And so there are 4 main honorifics I'm going to teach you based on gender and age. And so for older people, people who are around childbearing age or older, for men, you'll usually use the word pak. So for example, for me, it would be Pak Jordan. And for women, you usually say ibu or bu. And then for younger people, you usually use mas for boys and mbak for girls. And these honorifics are what they use in most of Java, and sometimes in other islands or other languages or other cultures, they use terms that are slightly different, especially for the younger people. But for most places, pak and ibu applies to almost everybody. And also, if you didn't notice, I didn't say pak, I said pak. In Indonesian, consonants are known as dead letters, huruf mati, which basically means that you use the letter, the shape of the letter, to cut off the sound. So instead of saying pak, instead of the breath at the end, you use the K sound to cut off the sound. So you say pak, pak. And so you'll see that in more other words, similar to mbak. Mbak ends with a K, but you don't really hear the K sound the same way that you do it in English. And so you'll always use these honorifics when talking to a lot of different kinds of people. For example, in Indonesian, thank you is terima kasih. Sometimes they shorten it to just makasih, and then they'll say makasih ya. So if I wanted to thank somebody who is older than me, I would say makasih ya pak, or makasih ya bu. And even if you don't speak Indonesian, this is a phrase that you can use every single day. Anytime you buy something, anytime you get help from anybody, you can use this phrase. So next up, we have maaf and permisi, which means sorry or excuse me. And so usually if you're trying to scoot in somewhere or you're trying to ask somebody a question, you'll always use permisi. But if you're trying to apologize for something or you accidentally bumped into somebody, you usually say maaf. Number 3 is jalan-jalan, which usually is translated as traveling or wandering around, but literally means walking. And so sometimes you'll hear Indonesians trying to translate something into English for you and say walking. And what they really mean is traveling or wandering around, going sightseeing, things like that. And so if somebody asks you what you're doing, you can just say jalan-jalan. The next one is also a repeated word, and you say hati-hati. And this one is really interesting because hati literally means liver. But in Indonesian, your liver is your center of emotion, not your heart. And so in English, your girlfriend breaks up with you, you can say you're heartbroken. But in Indonesian, you would say you're liver broken. Or if you ask an Indonesian person to draw a hati, a liver, they'll also draw the same heart shape because a heart isn't really this shape. It's just a symbol for emotion. And so hati-hati literally means be careful or take care. And so anytime you say goodbye to somebody, you can say hati-hati. The next one is super helpful if you actually want to try to talk to somebody. Sometimes it's awkward when you meet somebody new and you don't know if they speak English or not, or if they only speak Indonesian, or how you should talk to them. And so instead of saying that, you can say permisi, like we learned earlier. Anda bisa bahasa Inggris? That literally means, do you speak English? Anda bisa bahasa Inggris? And you can just add it with a question tone and people will understand that. And number 6 is jangan pedas, which literally means no spicy. And so if you're ever ordering food, which I encourage you to do, try to eat as much local food as possible. But if you want to try something new and you're worried about being able to handle the spice, you can say jangan pedas. The next one is nggak tahu or nggak paham, which means I don't know or I don't understand. But this is definitely a more informal way of saying this. But once again, we have the dead letters, the consonants, nggak. So it ends with a K, but it doesn't really make a K sound. And then tahu means know, and paham means understand. And this next one is also very interesting because I think it shows something very different culturally about Indonesians. You can say mau kemana, which literally means want to where, but it means where are you going, where are you headed, which might seem strange in English, because in English we think of that as personal information, but when you greet somebody in English, we say, hello, how are you? But if you were to say, how are you to an Indonesian person, they would think that is too private. They might think, who are you? Why do you care about my life? Because they don't really use it as a greeting. But on the other hand, in Indonesia, it's super common to meet somebody randomly on the street and ask them, where are you going? Where do you live? Where did you just come from? And so if you want to strike up a conversation with somebody, you can just say, mau kemana? Number 9, ini harganya berapa? Which means, how much does this cost? And so you can say this anytime after you're paying for something and they'll think it's really awesome. And in almost any country you go to, when you try to learn the local people's language, they'll be really appreciative and happy to talk to you, even if your Indonesian's not very good. But this is even more true in Indonesia. Even by saying just a few words, Indonesians will think you are the greatest person that has ever lived, especially because so few people try to learn Indonesian. And so the last thing I'm going to teach you is how to say goodbye. Some people might say selamat tinggal, but that seems very formal and I've never heard anybody actually say that. So instead, I would usually say mari, which can also be a greeting when you're just passing by somebody. Mari. Or when you're talking to little kids, you can usually say dada, da, and it's just kind of a cute way to say goodbye. And that's it. Those are the 10 most important phrases that I think you should learn. I've also included a link with all these terms in a Quizlet in the description if you're interested in using it. And if you're serious about learning Indonesian, I've also created an ebook with all my tips and tricks for learning languages, and specifically Indonesian, along with tons of resources like my favorite Indonesian YouTubers, my favorite Indonesian music, and tons of other things that will help you as you start to learn Indonesian. So I've also linked that down below if you're interested. Semoga berhasil dengan belajar bahasa Indonesia.